You're not entirely human, not in the way you think anyway. Right now, as you're listening to this, there's something ancient living inside your cells, something that existed long before your parents, your grandparents, your ancestors, stretching back hundreds of generations. It's not a virus. It's not a parasite. It's DNA from a species that went extinct 40,000 years ago. And yet, it's still here, still active, still shaping who you are in ways that science is only beginning to understand. If you took a sample of your DNA today and analysed it in a modern genetics lab, the computers would find something strange. Scattered throughout your genome, hidden among the 3 billion base pairs that make you who you are, there are fragments that don't quite belong. They're close to human DNA, but not quite right. The signature is different. The pattern is off. Like finding pages from a different book mixed into your own story, these are Neanderthal genes. And if you're of European, Asian, or Native American descent, somewhere between 1 and 4% of your DNA came from them. That might not sound like much, but in genetic terms it's it means that roughly 60 million base pairs in your genome were inherited from a species that most people think of as primitive cave dwellers who disappeared tens of thousands of years ago. But here's what keeps geneticists awake at night. These aren't random leftover fragments that accidentally stuck around. Natural selection has been working on our DNA for 40,000 years since Neanderthals vanished. Any genetic material that didn't serve a purpose should have been eliminated long ago. Genetic drift alone would have scattered these fragments into oblivion, and yet certain Neanderthal genes have persisted. Some have even increased in frequency in modern populations. That means they're doing something important enough that evolution has actively kept them around. The discovery happened almost by accident. In 2010, a team of scientists led by Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute managed something that seemed impossible. They extracted DNA from Neanderthal bones that had been buried in caves for 40,000 years. Bones that had been frozen, thawed, frozen again through countless ice ages. Bones where the DNA should have been degraded into useless fragments, millions of base pairs long. But they got it to work. And when they compared that ancient Neanderthal genome to modern human DNA, they found something nobody expected. We matched. Not completely, but enough to prove something extraordinary had happened. Our ancestors didn't just live alongside Neanderthals, they interbred with them multiple times, in multiple locations, and those encounters left permanent marks in our genome that we're still carrying today. If you're listening to this right now, wherever you are in the world, you're part of this story. Maybe you're in London as the sun comes up, or Los Angeles winding down after midnight, or somewhere in Tokyo during your afternoon commute. Drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. Because this story connects all of us, across every time zone, through genetic threads that go back to when there were multiple human species walking the earth at the same time. The mystery deepens when you look at which Neanderthal genes have survived. They're not random. They cluster in specific areas of our genome. Genes affecting skin and hair, genes involved in immune response, genes that influence how our brains develop and how we sleep. Some of these genes are found in more than 50% of people of European descent. That's not an accident. That's not random genetic drift. That's natural selection actively preserving Neanderthal DNA, because it does something beneficial that we still need. But scientists cannot fully explain why. They can see that these genes are being maintained. They can measure their effects on our bodies. They can track how they spread through populations. What they can't tell you is the complete story of why our ancestors needed these genes so desperately that they've survived 2,000 generations of human evolution. Why certain Neanderthal variants have become more common over time while others have disappeared. Why some of these ancient genes seem to protect us from certain diseases while making us more vulnerable to others. This isn't ancient history we're talking about. This is active functional DNA that's affecting your life right now. the way your immune system responds to infections, the colour of your skin and hair, how easily you tan, whether you're a morning person or a night owl, your risk for depression, diabetes, even how your body responded if you caught COVID-19. All of these traits, in some people, are partially influenced by genes that came from Neanderthals. The journey ahead takes us from the frozen caves of Siberia, where Neanderthal bones were discovered, to cutting-edge genetics laboratories where scientists are still trying to decode what this ancient DNA is doing inside us. We'll explore how two human species met and mingled tens of thousands of years ago. We'll look at the specific genes they gave us and what those genes actually do, and we'll confront the deepest mysteries that science still cannot answer. Why did Neanderthals disappear while their DNA lived on? What makes certain Neanderthal genes so valuable that evolution has kept them for 40,000 years? And what does it mean to be human when part of us isn't human at all? The ancient stranger in your DNA has a story to tell, and that story begins with understanding who the Neanderthals really were. For more than a century, Neanderthals were treated as a joke, the missing link, the brutish caveman, hunched over, dim-witted, barely capable of grunting at each other while they dragged clubs through the dirt. Museum displays showed them as hairy, slouching creatures, more ape than human. Cartoons turned them into punchlines. The very word Neanderthal became an insult meaning stupid, primitive, backwards. But here's the thing. Almost everything about that image was wrong. Completely, embarrassingly, scientifically wrong. And the people who created that myth knew it was wrong even as they were spreading it. The first Neanderthal skeleton was discovered in 1856 in Germany's Neander Valley. When scientists examined it, they found something that should have challenged every assumption about human uniqueness. This wasn't some primitive proto-human. The skull housed a brain larger than the average modern human. The bones showed evidence of healed injuries, meaning these people cared for their sick and wounded. The skeletal structure was robust but fully upright, perfectly capable of all the movements modern humans can make. But admitting that would have been inconvenient. This was Victorian Europe, an age of empires and racial hierarchies, when scientists were desperate to prove that modern Europeans represented the pinnacle of human evolution. So they reconstructed Neanderthals as brutish and inferior. They gave them slouched postures based on a skeleton that turned out to have severe arthritis. They drew them with jutting faces and limited intelligence based on assumptions rather than evidence. The myth was created not from the bones, but from the prejudices of the people interpreting them. The real Neanderthals were something else entirely. They stood as tall as modern humans, averaging around 5'5", which was actually taller than many ancient human populations. But where modern humans are built light and gracile, Neanderthals were constructed like biological tanks. Their bones were thick and dense, their muscle attachment points massive. A Neanderthal skeleton shows evidence of muscle mass that would require modern humans to spend years in intensive strength training to achieve. Their bodies were adaptations to survival in Ice Age Europe. Barrel chests provided more interior volume for larger lungs, helping them process the thin, cold air. Short, stocky limbs reduced surface area, conserving heat in environments where winter temperatures regularly dropped below zero and stayed there for months. Their nasal passages were enormous, giving cold air more time to warm and humidify before reaching the lungs. Every aspect of their physiology was optimized for environments that would kill an unprepared modern human in hours. And those brains. Neanderthal cranial capacity averaged 1,600 cubic centimeters. Modern humans average 1,400. They weren't just our equals intellectually. By raw brain size, they exceeded us. Now, brain size isn't everything. Structure and organization matter too. But the idea that Neanderthals were somehow mentally inferior is contradicted by everything we know about their neurobiology. These people dominated Europe and Western Asia for over 400,000 years. Think about that timeline. 400,000 years. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have only existed for about 300,000 years. Neanderthals were an older, more established species. They had survived multiple ice ages, adapted to dramatic climate swings, and developed technologies sophisticated enough to sustain populations across an enormous geographic range from Western Europe to Siberia, from the Mediterranean coast to the edges of the Arctic Circle. Their tool-making tradition, called the Mousterian culture, shows systematic planning and technical skill. They didn't just chip rocks until something useful appeared. They used prepared core techniques, carefully shaping stones so they could produce multiple identical tools from a single piece of raw material. Each tool was designed for specific purposes: scrapers for processing hides, points for hunting, knives for butchering. This is standardized manufacturing requiring the ability to visualize end products, plan multiple steps ahead, and pass complex knowledge between generations. Archaeological sites across Europe show Neanderthals occupying the same locations for thousands of years, returning to specific caves season after season, generation after generation. This wasn't random wandering. These were people who understood their territories intimately, who maintained cultural traditions across vast stretches of time, who built lives in places that modern humans would find uninhabitable without modern technology. They hunted Ice Age megafauna, woolly mammoths, giant elk, cave bears that stood 12 feet tall. This wasn't scavenging. Kill sites show evidence of strategic hunting, coordinated group tactics, sophisticated understanding of animal behavior. They were apex predators in environments filled with creatures that could easily kill them, and they survived. For 400,000 years, through climate catastrophes that wiped out countless other species, Neanderthals endured. They adapted. They thrived. They became masters of Ice Age Europe. These weren't evolutionary failures. These weren't primitive dead ends. These were successful, intelligent, highly adapted human beings who had carved out an existence in one of the harshest environments on Earth. So when modern humans finally left Africa 60,000 years ago and encountered Neanderthals for the first time, they weren't meeting cavemen. They were meeting equals, perhaps even superiors in certain domains. And what happened next would determine which human species would inherit the Earth. Picture a Neanderthal standing in a cave 130,000 years ago, holding an eagle talon in one hand and a sharp stone tool in the other. They're carefully carving notches into the talon, smoothing its edges, creating something that has no survival function whatsoever. When they're finished, they'll thread it onto a cord and wear it. Not because it helps them hunt, not because it keeps them warm, but because it means something, because it's beautiful. We found these eagle talon necklaces at Krapina in Croatia. 8 talons, all from white-tailed eagles, all carefully modified with cut marks showing they'd been strung together as jewellery. They predate the arrival of modern humans in Europe by 50,000 years. There's no way to argue that Neanderthals learned this from us. They were creating symbolic ornaments when our ancestors were still in Africa, possibly doing the exact same thing. This wasn't an isolated case. Neanderthal sites across Europe show evidence of pigment use. Red and black ochre, manganese dioxide, carefully collected, sometimes heated to produce different colours, ground into powder. They were painting something, their bodies, their tools, their living spaces. We don't have many surfaces that survived 100,000 years to tell us exactly what they painted, but we have the pigments, and nobody collects, processes, and uses pigments unless they're creating symbolic representations of something. Then there are the feathers. Neanderthal sites show evidence of systematic collection of bird feathers, particularly from raptors and corvids. Eagles, hawks, ravens, always the large impressive feathers, always from birds that have symbolic significance in nearly every human culture that came after. They weren't eating these birds. The bones show cut marks only where feathers attach, suggesting they were harvesting plumage for decoration. They were adorning themselves, making themselves look impressive, engaging in the same kind of symbolic self-presentation that humans have practiced for millennia. But the real controversy, the discovery that changed everything, happened in 3 Spanish caves, Maltravieso, Ardales and La Pasiega. Deep inside these caverns, on walls that haven't seen daylight in hundreds of thousands of years, there are paintings, hand stencils, geometric patterns, red dots and lines. Nothing incredibly complex, but undeniably intentional, undeniably art. When they were first discovered, everyone assumed they were made by modern humans. That's what archaeologists have been taught. Cave art equals modern humans, simple equation. But then researchers developed a new dating technique using uranium-thorium decay in the thin mineral crusts that had formed over the paintings, and the dates came back impossible. 64,000 years old. Some estimates go even older. Modern humans didn't reach Spain until 41,000 years ago. These paintings were made 20,000 years before we arrived. Made by Neanderthals. Made by a species we'd spent a century calling too primitive for symbolic thought. The scientific community is still fighting about this. Some researchers argue the dating might be wrong, that perhaps the mineral crusts formed after the paintings, and we're actually dating the cave formations, not the art itself. Others point out that even if the specific dates are debated, the evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior is overwhelming. You can argue about one cave, maybe 2. But when the evidence keeps accumulating from dozens of sites across thousands of miles and hundreds of thousands of years, denial starts looking less like skepticism and more like prejudice. And then there are the burials. This is where Neanderthal behavior becomes truly haunting. Because burial of the dead isn't just disposal of bodies, it's acknowledgement of death as something meaningful. It's the first glimmer of existential awareness, the realization that we exist and then we don't, and that this transition matters somehow. Shanidar Cave in Iraq gave us the most famous Neanderthal burial. Multiple individuals carefully placed in specific positions, some showing evidence of having been intentionally covered with soil and stones. One burial, Shanidar 4, was surrounded by flower pollen, lots of it. Multiple species, all plants that would have been blooming at the same time. For decades, researchers debated what this meant. Did Neanderthals place flowers on their dead? Was this evidence of ritual, of grief, of some concept of an afterlife? Some skeptics argued the pollen was intrusive, blown in by wind or brought in by rodents. But the concentrations were far higher around the body than elsewhere in the cave, and analysis of the pollen showed it came from entire flowers, not just scattered grains. Someone gathered those flowers, someone placed them with the dead. Whether this was ritual or simply grief, whether it represented spiritual beliefs or just emotional attachment to a lost family member, we'll never know for certain. But it was intentional, it was meaningful, it was profoundly human. Other Neanderthal burials show similar patterns. Bodies placed in fetal positions, stone tools buried alongside the dead, evidence of grave markers in some cases. This is systematic treatment of the deceased, repeated across multiple sites and tens of thousands of years. This is cultural tradition, passed down through generations. This is people who understood death and decided it required ceremony. But perhaps the most remarkable evidence for Neanderthal cognitive sophistication comes from a tiny bone found in Israel. The hyoid bone, a delicate horseshoe-shaped structure that sits in the throat and anchors the muscles used in speech. Modern humans have a distinctively shaped hyoid that supports our complex vocal abilities. For decades, researchers assumed Neanderthals must have had differently shaped hyoids, that their vocal anatomy must have been more limited than ours. Then they found one, and it was virtually identical to ours. Every proportion, every muscle attachment point, perfectly configured for the same kind of complex speech modern humans produce. Combined with genetic analysis showing Neanderthals had the same FOXP2 gene variant associated with language ability in modern humans, the evidence suggests they could speak, not grunt, not make simple sounds, actually speak, with the same vocal range and complexity we use. They probably had language, vocabulary, grammar, syntax, the ability to convey abstract concepts, tell stories, share knowledge that couldn't be demonstrated physically, and maybe they had music. Several Neanderthal sites have yielded what appear to be bone flutes, hollow bird bones with carefully drilled holes positioned at specific intervals. The most famous, found in Slovenia, has 4 holes aligned in a pattern that could produce multiple tones. Skeptics argue these might be natural formations or bones damaged by animal teeth. But statistical analysis of the hole placement shows they're far more regular than random damage would produce. And experimental archaeology has shown these instruments can produce clear musical notes. Did Neanderthals sit around fires making music? Did they have songs? Did children learn melodies from their parents the same way modern human children do? We can't know for certain. But the possibility hangs in the air like a half-remembered dream. A people who decorated themselves with feathers and jewellery, who painted in caves, who buried their dead with flowers, who could speak and possibly sing. These weren't the cavemen of popular imagination. These were people living lives rich with meaning and symbol and tradition, which raises an uncomfortable question. How many of our assumptions about intelligence and consciousness are simply wrong? We've spent centuries assuming that modern humans represent some pinnacle of cognitive evolution, that our way of thinking is somehow superior to all other species. But what if intelligence and awareness come in forms we don't recognize? What if Neanderthals perceived and understood the world in ways we can barely imagine, not because they were less advanced, but because they were different? What if we destroyed something irreplaceable when they disappeared? Not just a species, but an entire way of being human that we'll never fully understand because we weren't wise enough to preserve it. So imagine this moment, 60,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years. A small group of modern humans, maybe 50 people, maybe 100, crossing from Africa into the Arabian Peninsula. They're following animal migrations, tracking resources, doing what their ancestors had done for millennia. Except this time they don't stop. This time they keep going. North into the Levant, east toward Asia, eventually west into Europe. They're entering territories that haven't been empty. For 200,000 years these lands have been Neanderthal country, homelands occupied by people who knew every water source, every seasonal migration route, every cave that provided shelter during storms. People who had adapted to these environments so perfectly that their very bones had been reshaped by natural selection. And then one day, probably in the Levant, somewhere in what's now Israel or Lebanon, the two species met. Think about what that moment must have felt like. You're a Neanderthal hunter, tracking game through familiar territory. You've walked this valley 1,000 times. Your father taught you where the good flint outcrops are. Your grandmother told you stories about the winter her family sheltered in that cave over there. This is your land in every meaningful sense, and then you see them. People, but not your people. Similar but wrong. Too tall, too thin. Faces shaped differently, moving differently, using tools you don't recognize. Or flip the perspective. You're a modern human who's been walking for weeks through empty grasslands. Your group is tired, low on water, worried about finding the next reliable food source. Then you crest a ridge and see smoke rising from a valley below. People. But when you get closer, something's off. They're built like wrestlers, massively muscled with faces that protrude in ways your peoples don't. They're using spears you've never seen before, making sounds that might be language but you can't quite understand. What do? Do you approach? Do you run? Do you hide and watch? The archaeological evidence suggests all of these things happened at different times and places. The Levant shows something remarkable. Stratified cave deposits where Neanderthal artifacts and modern human artifacts alternate over tens of thousands of years. This site has Neanderthal tools. A few thousand years later, modern human tools. Then Neanderthal tools again. Back and forth, like the two species were playing a very slow game of musical chairs with the same territories. This pattern suggests something important. These encounters weren't always violent. If every meeting ended in warfare, in one side exterminating the other, you wouldn't see this kind of peaceful alternation. You'd see one set of artifacts abruptly replacing the other, signs of burning and destruction. Instead, the evidence looks more like both groups were using the same spaces at different times. Maybe seasonally. Maybe whenever one group's population grew too large and they needed to expand. The other group simply moved elsewhere, avoiding conflict. Maybe they had some kind of agreement, some way of negotiating territory without constant bloodshed. But that doesn't mean it was always peaceful. Some sites show evidence of violence. Neanderthal remains with injuries that look like they came from human weapons. Modern human skeletons with trauma patterns, suggesting conflicts with something, someone. Competition for resources has been a driver of human violence for as long as humans have existed. There's no reason to think these encounters were immune to that reality. The truth is probably complicated, probably variable. Some groups might have been hostile to outsiders by default, attacking on sight. Others might have been curious, cautious, willing to establish some kind of coexistence. Individual personalities would have mattered. A generous Neanderthal leader might have allowed modern humans to hunt in their territory. A paranoid one might have driven them off with threats of violence. Same with modern human groups encountering Neanderthals. But here's what's fascinating. Despite the potential for violence, despite the competition for resources, there's also evidence of something else. Something that suggests at least some of these encounters were far more intimate than anyone expected. Archaeological sites in the Levant show something peculiar. Modern human sites with Neanderthal tool styles. Neanderthal sites with modern human innovations. This isn't convergent evolution, isn't two groups independently inventing the same technology. The timing and distribution are too precise. This is cultural exchange. This is one group watching the other and thinking, that's clever, we should try that. This is learning across species lines. Maybe it happened through observation. Modern humans watching from a distance as Neanderthals manufactured their distinctive Mousterian tools, then trying to replicate the technique. Neanderthals noticing the more efficient blade production methods modern humans used and adapting them. No direct contact required, just proximity and intelligence. Or maybe it was more direct. Maybe there were moments of actual cooperation. A Neanderthal group and a modern human group both hunting the same migrating herd, deciding it was more profitable to work together than to fight. Brief alliances forming during resource scarcity, then dissolving when conditions improved. Temporary camps shared during harsh winters when survival mattered more than tribal identity. Trade is possible too. Both species used pigments for decoration. Both valued certain types of stone for tool-making. If a Neanderthal group controlled access to high-quality flint outcrops, and a modern human group had access to good sources of ochre, exchange makes sense. You don't need sophisticated language to trade. You need gestures, demonstrations, the universal human understanding that giving something can create obligation, relationship, connection. But the most remarkable evidence wasn't discovered in ancient tools or cave paintings. It was discovered in a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, in 2010, when a team of geneticists successfully sequenced the Neanderthal genome and compared it to modern human DNA. They were expecting to find differences, genetic markers that clearly separated the two species, evidence that would help explain why we survived and they didn't. What they found instead was impossible. Neanderthal DNA in modern humans. Not a little. Not a trace amount that could be explained by ancient shared ancestry. Actual Neanderthal genetic sequences showing up in people alive today. 1 to 4% of the genome of everyone of non-African descent is Neanderthal. This could only mean one thing. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just meet. They interbred. They had children together. Children who survived, who reproduced, who passed on genetic material from both species to every generation that followed. Think about what this means. Somewhere in the Levant, perhaps 55,000 years ago, a modern human and a Neanderthal formed a relationship intimate enough to produce offspring. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was something darker, violence and coercion. Maybe it was simple pragmatism, a way to forge alliances between groups. Maybe it was curiosity, attraction, the same forces that draw humans together across any cultural boundary. However it happened multiple times. The genetic evidence shows several distinct episodes of interbreeding, not just one event, but repeated encounters over thousands of years. Modern humans and Neanderthals living in proximity long enough for relationships to form, children to be born, and hybrid populations to integrate back into both parent species. The children of these unions must have been remarkable. Hybrids carrying genetic adaptations from two different evolutionary paths. Neanderthal cold weather adaptations combined with modern human cognitive traits. The best survival tools from both species merged in a single individual. And here's the stunning part. Those children weren't sterile evolutionary dead ends. They survived. They thrived. They contributed genetic material that spread through the entire modern human population outside Africa. Every person with European, Asian, or Native American ancestry carries pieces of the Neanderthal genome, genes that helped our ancestors survive ice ages, resist diseases, adapt to new environments. We didn't just meet Neanderthals, we merged with them, absorbed them, became something neither species was before. The story of human evolution isn't a simple linear progression from primitive to advanced. It's a braided river, multiple streams flowing together, separating, rejoining. Genetic material from multiple human species combining and recombining to create the modern human genome. Those first encounters weren't the end of a story. They were the beginning of something we're still trying to understand. Something that lives inside every one of us, written in the very structure of our DNA. The discovery happened in fragments, literally. Picture this. You're a geneticist trying to extract DNA from bones that have been buried for 40,000 years. Not bones that were carefully preserved in controlled conditions. Bones that spent millennia in caves, exposed to water, bacteria, temperature fluctuations, and countless other forces of decay. Every single day that passed since that individual died, their DNA was degrading, breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces, being contaminated by bacteria, fungi, and the DNA of every organism that came into contact with those remains. By the time you get your hands on those bones, the DNA isn't an intact genome anymore. It's shattered into millions of fragments, most of them shorter than 100 base pairs, mixed in with DNA from every microbe that colonized the bones over the past 40 millennia. Finding actual Neanderthal DNA in that mess is like trying to reassemble a book that's been put through a shredder, then mixed with the shredded remains of 1,000 other books, then left outside for 40,000 years. That was the challenge facing Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. For over a decade, they'd been working on the seemingly impossible problem of sequencing ancient DNA. They'd had some success with shorter timeframes, extinct animals from a few thousand years ago, but Neanderthals? That was in a completely different category of difficult. The technical obstacles were staggering. Ancient DNA is chemically modified by time, damaged in ways that make standard sequencing techniques fail. You need new methods, new technologies, new approaches to every step of the process. Extraction techniques that can recover fragments too degraded for conventional methods. Sequencing technologies sensitive enough to read DNA from samples where 99% of the genetic material comes from contaminating organisms. Computer algorithms sophisticated enough to distinguish genuine ancient sequences from modern contamination. They worked on it for years, developing techniques, testing approaches, failing, learning, trying again, getting better at extracting DNA, getting better at filtering out contamination, slowly, painstakingly, building up libraries of Neanderthal genetic sequences from multiple individuals, multiple sites across Europe. Then in 2010 they published their results. The first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, not complete, full of gaps, but substantial enough to allow meaningful comparisons with modern human DNA. The scientific community was electrified. Here, finally, was a way to answer questions that had been debated for decades. How different were Neanderthals from modern humans? Were we really separate species or just divergent populations? When did our lineages split? Could we have interbred? Pääbo's team ran the comparisons. Neanderthal DNA versus modern human DNA from populations around the world. They were looking for differences, for genetic markers that would help explain the evolutionary relationship between the two species. What they found shocked everyone. Modern humans of European and Asian descent showed something impossible. Small sections of their genomes that were more similar to Neanderthal DNA than to DNA from modern Africans. The only explanation was a recent gene flow, interbreeding. Not hundreds of thousands of years ago when the species first diverged, but recently within the time frame when modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted in Europe and the Middle East. The numbers were stunning, 1 to 4%. That's how much of the genome of non-African humans comes directly from Neanderthals. It sounds small, just a few percentage points. But in terms of actual genetic information, it's enormous. The human genome contains about 3 billion base pairs. 1% of that is 30 million base pairs. Enough genetic information to fill several large books. That's how much Neanderthal DNA modern humans carry. Not everyone believed it at first. The initial reaction from many scientists was skepticism. Ancient DNA studies had a history of contamination problems. Were they really looking at genuine Neanderthal sequences, or had modern human DNA somehow contaminated the samples? Maybe lab workers handling the bones, maybe DNA from researchers who excavated the sites, maybe environmental contamination from humans who'd visited the caves in recent centuries. Pääbo's team had anticipated this. They'd developed stringent contamination controls. They'd sequenced DNA from multiple Neanderthal individuals from different sites across Europe. They'd used statistical methods to identify and exclude any sequences that looked like modern contamination. Most importantly, they'd found Neanderthal DNA, sequences that were different from any modern human, but those unique sequences still showed up in the genomes of modern Europeans and Asians. There was no escaping the conclusion. Neanderthals and modern humans had interbred. The evidence was written in our genes. But the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. If only 1 to 4% of non-African DNA is Neanderthal, that suggests interbreeding was relatively rare. Maybe just a few encounters, a few hybrid children who survived and reproduced. So why does so much Neanderthal DNA persist? Think about it. If you have a rare interbreeding event 55,000 years ago, the DNA from that event should be diluted more with every generation. One hybrid child contributes 50% Neanderthal DNA to their offspring. But those offspring breed with modern humans, and their children are only 25% Neanderthal. The next generation, 12.5%. After just a dozen generations, the Neanderthal contribution would be less than 0.1%. After 2,000 generations, it should be essentially gone, washed out by the overwhelming tide of modern human genetic material. Yet, it persists. Not just traces, but substantial chunks of functional Neanderthal DNA. Genes that code for actual proteins that affect skin color, hair texture, immune function, metabolism. This DNA didn't persist by accident. It persists because it provides advantages, because natural selection actively maintained it in the modern human population. This is where the story gets really interesting. Those rare encounters between modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just produce curiosities, hybrid children who might have struggled to fit into either society. They produced evolutionary advantages. Neanderthals had been living in Europe and Western Asia for 200,000 years. They'd adapted to local diseases, local climates, local environmental challenges in ways modern humans hadn't. They carried genetic variants that helped them survive in Ice Age Europe. When modern humans arrived from Africa, they were walking into unfamiliar territory. New diseases, new climates, new pathogens their immune systems had never encountered. The children of mixed unions inherited some of the Neanderthal adaptations. They were better equipped to survive European diseases, better adapted to cold weather, better able to process local foods, and those advantages meant they left more offspring. Generation by generation, the beneficial Neanderthal genes spread through the modern human population. Not all Neanderthal DNA, though. The genetic analysis reveals something fascinating. The Neanderthal sequences that persist in modern humans aren't random. They're concentrated in certain regions of the genome, genes related to immune function, skin and hair characteristics, metabolism. Meanwhile, other regions show almost no Neanderthal ancestry, particularly genes related to reproduction and brain development. This suggests some Neanderthal genes were beneficial and spread through the population. Others were neutral and gradually disappeared. Still others might have been actively harmful, reducing fertility or causing developmental problems, and natural selection eliminated them. The picture that emerges is extraordinary. Modern humans didn't simply replace Neanderthals. We absorbed them, integrated their genetic innovations into our own genome, took the best of what their 200,000 years of European adaptation had produced and made it our own. We became, in a very real sense, a hybrid species. Not purely modern human, but a fusion of modern human and Neanderthal, combining genetic material from two different evolutionary paths. Every person of non-African descent carries this ancient merger in their DNA. Billions of base pairs of Neanderthal code still functioning, still affecting how our bodies work, still providing benefits that helped our ancestors survive. The stranger isn't just in our past. The stranger is in our cells, in our genes, in the fundamental architecture of who we are. And the discoveries were just beginning. When modern humans left Africa 60,000 years ago, they walked into a biological minefield. Everything was new climates, new foods, new predators. But most dangerous of all, new diseases, pathogens they'd never encountered before. Bacteria and viruses that had been evolving alongside Neanderthals for hundreds of thousands of years. Their immune systems had no preparation, no ancestral memory of these threats, no genetic resistance built up over countless generations. It should have been catastrophic. History shows us what happens when populations encounter unfamiliar diseases. When Europeans reached the Americas, they brought smallpox, measles, and influenza, diseases their immune systems had adapted to over millennia. The indigenous populations, who had no prior exposure, were devastated. In some regions, 90% mortality. Entire civilizations collapsed, not from warfare, but from pathogens their bodies couldn't fight. That's what modern humans faced in Europe. Walking into an ecosystem of disease they'd never experienced. Facing immune challenges that should have stopped their expansion before it really began. But it didn't happen that way. The expansion was successful. Modern humans not only survived but thrived. They spread across Europe, replaced or absorbed Neanderthal populations, and established themselves as the dominant human species across multiple continents. So what was different? The answer was hidden in one of the most sophisticated parts of our genome, the human leukocyte antigen system, HLA for short. This is your immune system's early warning network, the genetic machinery that helps your body distinguish self from foreign, friend from threat, harmless protein from deadly pathogen. Here's how it works. Every cell in your body displays protein fragments on its surface, little molecular flags that tell your immune system what's going on inside. When a virus infects a cell, viral proteins get processed and displayed on the surface. Your immune T cells patrol constantly, checking these displays. When they spot something foreign, something that doesn't match your HLA templates, they trigger an immune response. The infected cell gets destroyed before the virus can replicate. The effectiveness of this system depends entirely on diversity. The more varied your HLA genes, the more different pathogens you can recognize and fight. It's like having a broader library of mug shots. The more variants you carry, the more likely you'll recognize a new threat when it shows up. Evolution generally maintains HLA diversity through something called balancing selection. Rare variants provide advantages because they can recognize pathogens that common variants miss. This keeps multiple versions circulating in the population rather than one variant dominating. But even with balancing selection, it takes thousands of generations to develop HLA variants specifically adapted to local diseases. Modern humans arriving in Europe didn't have thousands of generations. They had right now. They needed immune adaptations to European pathogens immediately, or they'd die before they could reproduce. Neanderthals, meanwhile, had been living in Europe and Western Asia for 300,000 years. Their immune systems had been adapting to local pathogens for 12,000 generations. They'd encountered every bacterial infection, every viral outbreak, every parasitic disease that had swept through European populations during that entire span. Natural selection had relentlessly refined their HLA genes, favouring variants that could recognise and fight the specific pathogens of Ice Age Europe. When modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, something remarkable happened. The hybrid children inherited Neanderthal HLA variants. Suddenly they had immune genes already adapted to European diseases. They could fight infections that killed their purely modern human cousins. They survived, they reproduced, and those Neanderthal immune genes spread. The genetic evidence for this is overwhelming. When scientists analysed which Neanderthal DNA segments persist most strongly in modern populations, HLA genes topped the list. In some modern European populations, up to 50% of HLA variants can be traced directly to Neanderthal ancestry, not 1 or 2%. 50%. Half of one of the most important immune system genes comes from our extinct cousins. This isn't random genetic drift. This is natural selection operating at maximum intensity. These genes spread because they provided massive survival advantages. Having Neanderthal HLA variants might have meant the difference between surviving a bacterial infection and dying from it, between weathering a viral outbreak and succumbing to it, between leaving children who carried your genes forward or ending your lineage entirely. But the immune system transfer went beyond just HLA genes. Modern humans also inherited Neanderthal variants affecting innate immunity, the first line of defense against infection. Genes that control inflammatory response, genes that recognize bacterial cell walls, genes that help fight off viral infections before adaptive immunity even kicks in. One particularly interesting set of genes affects toll-like receptors. These are proteins that sit on immune cell surfaces and recognize common features of bacterial and viral pathogens. When they detect an infection, they trigger inflammation and alert the adaptive immune system. Neanderthal variants of these genes show up at high frequencies in modern populations, suggesting they provided significant advantages against European infections. The transfer was so effective that some researchers call it adaptive introgression. Introgression is the technical term for when genes flow from one species into another through interbreeding. Adaptive introgression means those genes spread because they provide fitness advantages. The interbreeding wasn't just a curiosity, it was an evolutionary shortcut. Modern humans acquired 300,000 years of European immune adaptation in a single generation through hybridization. But there's a dark side to this gift, a price we're still paying today. Those same Neanderthal immune genes that helped our ancestors survive European diseases also make modern humans more susceptible to certain autoimmune conditions. Genes that trigger aggressive inflammatory responses are great when you're fighting off deadly infections. Not so great when they overreact to harmless substances or start attacking your own tissues. Neanderthal genetic variants have been linked to increased risk of allergies, asthma, type 2 diabetes, Crohn's disease, various autoimmune disorders. The same hyperactive immune response that killed bacteria before they could establish infections also makes some people's immune systems attack pollen, dust mites, or their own intestinal lining. This is the evolutionary trade-off. Neanderthal immune genes were selected for survival in a world full of deadly pathogens, a world where the biggest threat was infection, not autoimmune disease, a world where a hair-trigger immune response meant living long enough to reproduce. In the modern world, with antibiotics and sanitation and dramatically reduced infection risk, that same hair-trigger response causes chronic inflammation and disease. The irony is profound. Genes from an extinct species saved our ancestors from diseases that would have stopped the human expansion out of Africa. Those same genes now contribute to modern health problems that affect millions. We carry both the benefits and the costs of that ancient hybridization event, both the survival advantages that let our ancestors thrive and the autoimmune vulnerabilities that plague their descendants. And we're still discovering new connections. Research continues to reveal Neanderthal immune genes affecting everything from COVID-19 susceptibility to response to modern vaccines. The ancient stranger isn't just a curiosity from our past. It's an active participant in your immune system right now, affecting how your body responds to every infection, every vaccine, every immune challenge you face. That small group of hybrid children born 55,000 years ago didn't just survive, they changed the course of human evolution. They gave our species the immune tools needed to colonize new continents. But they also gave us genetic vulnerabilities we're only beginning to understand. The Neanderthal genes didn't stop with immunity. They affected everything. When our ancestors pushed deeper into Neanderthal territory, immunity wasn't their only problem. They had walked out of the tropics into a world where the sky itself had turned against them. Near the equator, sunlight is a constant, intense, direct, almost punishing. For millions of years, human skin had evolved under that blazing sun, building a natural shield. High levels of melanin, dark pigmentation, functioned like biological sunscreen. It protected DNA from ultraviolet damage. It defended against skin cancer. It prevented the breakdown of folate, a crucial vitamin for fetal development and cell division. In Africa, dark skin was a life-saving adaptation. But carry that same skin far to the north, and something strange happens. The sun weakens. Days grow shorter. Winters stretch into long seasons of dim grey light. The atmosphere filters out more ultraviolet radiation before it reaches the ground. The same pigment that once protected you now becomes a barrier. Melanin blocks UVB rays, the very wavelengths your skin needs to synthesize vitamin D. And vitamin D is not optional. It's essential for bone growth, immune function, brain development. Without enough, children develop rickets. Bones soften and bend. Pelvises deform. In women, that can mean fatal complications in childbirth. In men and women alike, it means fragile skeletons in a world where every fall, every hunt, every struggle for survival demands physical resilience. Your ancestors had changed continents, but their skin hadn't caught up yet. Neanderthals, however, had been living in these low-light environments for hundreds of thousands of years. They had already done the evolutionary work. Their bodies had negotiated a new deal with the northern sun. When scientists started comparing Neanderthal genomes with those of modern humans, certain patterns jumped out. Among the most striking were variants in genes controlling pigmentation. Genes like MC1R, SLC24A5, SLC45A2, and others involved in how melanin is produced, distributed and regulated in the skin and hair. Some of these Neanderthal variants are associated with lighter skin, others with variations in hair colour, reddish tones, lighter browns, maybe even blonde shades in some individuals. Neanderthals were not a uniform population of identical cave dwellers. They were as varied as we are, and that variation included how they looked. In a northern climate, these lighter pigmentation patterns carry a simple, brutal logic. Less melanin means more UVB penetrates the skin. More UVB means more vitamin D production, even under weak winter sun. In an environment where every photon counts, paler skin isn't cosmetic, it's survival technology. When modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, they didn't just swap immune system tricks. They traded light processing hardware. Hybrid children who carried Neanderthal pigmentation variants had an edge. Their bodies converted the thin northern sunlight into vitamin D more efficiently. Their bones mineralized properly. Their skeletons grew strong. Their pelvises formed correctly. Their immune systems, which also rely on vitamin D signaling, functioned more effectively in these new conditions. These weren't slow, subtle advantages. In harsh, Ice Age environments, they could be the difference between carrying a child to term or losing it, between surviving adolescence or dying from fractures and infections. Natural selection doesn't need much time when the stakes are that high. A few percentage points of survival advantage are enough to change the genetic landscape in a handful of generations. It wasn't just skin colour. Neanderthal DNA also shows up in a family of genes related to keratin. Keratin is the tough structural protein that makes up your outer layer of skin, your hair and your nails. Think of it as your body's armour and insulation, woven into every surface that faces the outside world. In Neanderthals, some keratin-related genes appear to have been tuned for life in cold, abrasive environments. Icy winds, rough animal hides, heavy clothing, and constant physical strain. When geneticists mapped where Neanderthal DNA tends to persist in modern humans, they found enriched regions around keratin-associated genes, variants that likely affected hair thickness, straightness or waviness, and the toughness of skin. The kind of changes that might make hair a better insulator, skin more resistant to friction from furs and tools, or more resilient against cracking in cold, dry air. Imagine a child with a little extra Neanderthal keratin influence, slightly thicker hair trapping a bit more warmth around the scalp, skin that chafes less under primitive clothing, hands that tolerate repetitive use of stone tools and wooden spears without splitting open as easily. None of these traits guarantee survival, but in a marginal environment, every tiny advantage compounds. Modern populations in Eurasia still carry clusters of these Neanderthal keratin variants at higher frequencies than you would expect from random chance alone. That suggests selection. Those traits were being favoured. The pattern is unmistakable. Wherever the environment became colder, darker, more seasonally extreme, Neanderthal-derived variants related to skin, hair, and keratin seem to have spread more readily. It's as if the genes themselves were migrating, riding along in human bodies, leaping from village to village, slowly painting the map of Eurasia with the legacy of an extinct people. The speed of this transformation left genetic fingerprints. When researchers scan modern European and Asian genomes, they see long segments of Neanderthal DNA around these pigmentation and keratin genes that are more common than neighbouring regions. That's a hallmark of positive selection. These were not neutral passengers. They were being actively pulled upward in frequency by survival and reproduction. In some cases, Neanderthal-derived alleles reach frequencies of 30, 40, even 60% in certain populations. For something that originally entered the human gene pool through a tiny trickle of interbreeding, that's extraordinary. It suggests that once these traits arrived, nature grabbed them with both hands. Of course, evolution rarely gives gifts without strings attached. Some of the same pathways that regulate skin pigmentation also influence risk of skin cancer and other conditions. Lighter skin boosts vitamin D production in northern latitudes but increases vulnerability if that skin moves back toward intense ultraviolet regions, without the lifestyle of our ancestors, without constant shade-seeking, without protective clothing made from animal hides. Keratins, too, are involved in more than just outer toughness. Variants in these genes have been linked, in some studies, to differences in susceptibility to skin disorders, allergies, and even how easily you develop calluses or scars. The Neanderthal inheritance may have made our ancestors' skin more robust in the Ice Age, but in the modern world, with central heating and synthetic fabrics, those same tweaks sometimes misfire. Even hair may carry echoes of ancient compromise. Some Neanderthal-linked variants are associated with straight hair in East Asian populations, with texture differences in Europeans, with subtle shifts in how hair grows and sheds across seasons. Today, these variations are mostly aesthetic, but their roots lie in survival. How well hair trapped heat, repelled water, or resisted tangling under constant movement and weather exposure. You might see the effects every morning in the mirror. If you have lighter skin and your ancestry traces back to Europe or parts of Western Asia, some portion of your pigmentation machinery may have Neanderthal origins. If your hair is unusually thick or coarse, or has a certain way of curling or staying straight, there's a non-zero chance that small stretches of your genome were once carried in the bodies of Neanderthals, walking through snow-covered valleys 100,000 years ago. Even if your ancestry is primarily African, and you carry little or no Neanderthal DNA, your appearance is still shaped by the same evolutionary pressures: UV radiation, vitamin D balance, skin protection, that sculpted all human populations, different solutions to the same ancient equations. The point isn't whether you look Neanderthal, the point is that your body, your skin, your hair, the way you interact with sunlight, has been negotiated over by natural selection for hundreds of thousands of years in dialogue with multiple human species. When you step outside on a cloudy winter day and feel the faint chill on your face, your skin responds according to a script written long before cities, long before agriculture, long before history itself. Some of the lines in that script were written by your direct Homo sapiens ancestors. Others were borrowed, spliced in from Neanderthals, who learned the hard way how to survive under a weak northern sun. The ancient stranger in your DNA doesn't just whisper in your immune cells. It shapes the colour of your freckles, the thickness of your hair, the way your skin tans or burns. It decided long ago how your body would negotiate with the sky, and as night falls and sunlight disappears, that same Neanderthal legacy shows up somewhere else entirely, in how easily or how poorly you fall asleep. Maybe you've noticed it. You lie in bed, the clock says midnight, then 1, then 2. Your body refuses to shut down, your mind keeps drifting, circling, replaying, and yet, come dawn, you feel strangely alert. Morning light hits your eyes, and something in you flicks on like a switch. Or maybe it's the opposite. You're one of those people who starts yawning as soon as the sun goes down. 10 p.m. feels late. Your energy peaks early, wanes early. Late-night parties feel like mild torture. You watch the people who come alive at midnight and wonder if they're even the same species as you. For a long time we treated this as just personality. Night owl, morning person, cute labels for quirks of habit and lifestyle. Then geneticists started digging into the clockwork inside your cells. Every cell in your body runs on time. Buried in your DNA are genes that keep track of the day. Genes with names like PER, CRY, CLOCK, and ARNTL. They form feedback loops that rise and fall on a roughly 24-hour cycle, synchronizing sleep, body temperature, hormone release, digestion, even how your immune system behaves. This is your circadian rhythm, your internal day. When scientists compared these clock genes in modern humans to the Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes, they found something unexpected. In among the familiar Homo sapiens variants were stretches of DNA that clearly came from somewhere else. Some of your timekeeping machinery is Neanderthal. At first, this sounded almost poetic. Of course, the people of the Ice Age North, the masters of long winters and short summers, would have tweaked their internal clocks. But when researchers looked closer, the pattern became stranger. Several Neanderthal-derived variants turn up more often in people who describe themselves as morning types. Others appear linked to being more sensitive to light cues, how quickly your body's clock shifts when the days grow longer or shorter. Statistical studies involving hundreds of thousands of people show that small fragments of Neanderthal DNA are nudging your chronotype. Whether you naturally tilt toward early rising or late nights, this wasn't just noise. The signal kept appearing in independent data sets. People with more of certain Neanderthal clock variants were slightly more likely to be larks, not owls. Why would that be? Think about where Neanderthals lived. They spent hundreds of thousands of years in Europe and Western Asia, at latitudes where daylight is not a constant, gentle rhythm the way it is near the equator. In winter, the sun can scrape along the horizon for only a few hours, casting a thin, oblique light. In summer, it lingers deep into the night, barely dipping below the skyline. Twilight stretches. Darkness becomes a season, not just a part of the day. If you take a body whose timekeeping evolved in the tropics, where day and night are nearly equal all year round, and you drop it into this world of extremes, the old schedule breaks. Wake with the sun, sleep with the dark. What happens when there is almost no sun, or almost no dark? Neanderthals had to solve this problem because their survival depended on it. Hunting large animals requires coordination. You can't stumble around half asleep in the thin window of usable light. You need your group awake, alert, synchronized, when conditions are right, even if that means waking before sunrise or staying restless through the long, shimmering evenings of a northern summer. One idea is that Neanderthal clock genes became more tightly coupled to tiny changes in light. As soon as dawn began to smear the sky with grey, their timekeeping machinery might have shifted into day mode. Melatonin, the hormone that signals night, would shut down faster. Cortisol and other wake-promoting signals would ramp up sooner. Those with this trait would be on their feet earlier, ready to exploit every minute of weak light. In that world, morning person isn't a preference, it's an adaptation. Another possibility is that Neanderthals diversified their sleep strategies. In unstable environments, groups can gain an advantage if not everyone sleeps at the same time. Some individuals naturally wake earlier, others stay up later. The group as a whole is never completely vulnerable. Modern hunter-gatherer studies hint at something like this. In some bands, if you track sleep over many nights, there are surprisingly few moments when every adult is asleep at once. Chronotype diversity, the spread between early and late sleepers, creates a rolling watch, a kind of built-in night shift without any planning. Imagine a Neanderthal camp in deep winter. Firelight flickers inside a shallow cave. Snow dampens sound outside. A few individuals wired by their particular combination of clock genes find it easy to wake in the pre-dawn chill and feed the embers, check the surroundings, listen for predators. Others, whose cycles drift later, remain alert long after dusk, their brains still humming while everyone else drifts off. Nobody decided to stand guard. Their DNA did. If this kind of asynchronous sleeping helped Neanderthals survive, then clock gene variants promoting slight shifts in timing, slight changes in light sensitivity would have been favoured. And when modern humans arrived from Africa, carrying their more equatorial rhythms, they suddenly encountered a population whose internal clocks had already been tuned to the north. Through interbreeding, some of those tuned clocks entered our lineage. But here's where the mystery deepens. When researchers run computer models and evolutionary simulations, not all of these Neanderthal clock variants behave like classic good adaptations. Some show weak or inconsistent signs of positive selection. Others look like they've drifted around, neither strongly favoured nor eliminated. They don't line up neatly with simple stories. If being a morning person was always advantageous in the north, why didn't one optimal variant sweep through entire populations? Why does the modern human gene pool preserve a patchwork, some Neanderthal influenced, some not, across different regions and ancestries? One answer is that environment kept changing. Ice sheets advanced and retreated. Forests flickered into grasslands and back again. Cloud cover, temperature, available prey. All of it fluctuated on timescales of centuries and millennia. Under those conditions, there might not be a single best sleep pattern. Flexibility itself becomes a real adaptation. What helps in one century might hurt in another. A variant that favours ultra-early rising under one set of conditions might be a liability when winters become even darker, or when social structures shift and group activities happen at different times. Natural selection pushes one way then another, like wind worrying at a flag. Another answer is that our lives changed faster than our genes could. The Neanderthal clock evolved under stars and firelight. No street lamps, no glowing screens, no artificial sunrise alarm clocks. Your brain's timekeeping machinery still expects that world. It still listens for the blue rich light of morning, the dim amber of dusk. It still uses melatonin to whisper night is coming through your blood. But now you live inside a storm of light pollution. Evening is no longer dark. Morning can arrive on command from a bedside lamp. If some of your clock genes came from Neanderthals who were exquisitely sensitive to faint northern dawns, that same sensitivity may misfire when your room is lit by LEDs until midnight. Your body may interpret the glow as endless afternoon. Melatonin release gets delayed. Sleep comes late. You wake groggy, misaligned with the external clock you have to obey. School, work, alarms. The old adaptation becomes a modern annoyance, and yet these Neanderthal-linked variants persist. Inside office workers who rely on coffee, inside nurses on rotating shifts, inside long-distance travellers whose bodies rebel at every time zone crossing. they persist inside you. When you find yourself fully awake at 5 in the morning for no obvious reason, or suddenly sleepy at 9 at night while everyone else wants one more episode, you're feeling the tension between at least 3 things: your immediate environment, your personal habits, and a timekeeping system shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution across multiple human species. Some nights, when you're lying there unable to drift off, it isn't just stress or screens or caffeine. Part of the restlessness may be genetic echoes, ancient instructions that once told a Neanderthal body, stay alert, something might move in the darkness. Other mornings, when you wake easily before your alarm, feeling strangely attuned to the first hint of brightness seeping around the curtains, you might be experiencing the same sensitivity that helps someone in Ice Age Europe rise with the earliest winter light and seize a narrow hunting window. Science can trace the outlines of this story. It can point to specific positions in your genome, to letters of DNA where a Neanderthal and a modern human once differed. It can show how those letters nudge your sleep by minutes or hours. But it can't yet tell you, with certainty, why natural selection preserved this exact blend. Why your particular combination of clock genes exists and not another. The models don't quite capture it. The statistics gesture at advantages and trade-offs, but the narrative remains incomplete. So tonight, when you feel your eyelids grow heavy, or refuse to, remember, the timing of your sleep is not an accident, and it's not entirely yours. It's a negotiation among ancestors who never met, across landscapes you will never walk. Part of your circadian rhythm was written by people who watched auroras ripple across glacial skies, by hunters who measured seasons by the angle of the sun on snow. Their days ended long ago. Their nights are still inside you. If Neanderthals could leave their mark on when you sleep, it raises a deeper, stranger possibility. What if they also left fingerprints on how you think? For a long time, scientists assumed the answer was no. Brains were sacred territory. The idea that bits of Neanderthal DNA might be quietly shaping modern human cognition sounded like science fiction. Or worse, an excuse for people to tell bad stories about primitive and advanced minds. Then the brain imaging studies started. In one set of experiments, researchers took thousands of modern humans, scanned their brains, and compared the images to their genomes. Not just looking at one gene here or there, but sifting through millions of genetic variants, including the ones we know came from Neanderthals. The results were unsettling. Certain Neanderthal-derived variants were consistently associated with subtle differences in brain structure, not bigger or smaller in some cartoonish way, but changes in how regions were shaped and connected. Slight shifts in the thickness of the cerebral cortex, tiny alterations in the curvature of the skull, differences in the way white matter tracks, the brain's wiring, ran between regions involved in language, memory, and spatial reasoning. It wasn't a transformation. Nobody grew a Neanderthal brain in a Homo sapiens skull, but the data suggested that in some people, little fragments of archaic DNA were nudging brain development in specific directions. One particularly debated finding involves the shape of the back of the skull. If you've seen a reconstruction of a Neanderthal, you might remember that classic bun at the rear of the head, a bulging, elongated dome where their enormous brains tucked into thick bone. Modern human skulls, by contrast, tend to be more rounded, with different proportions front to back. When researchers looked at modern Europeans and Asians whose genomes contained certain Neanderthal-derived variants in genes related to bone and brain development, they noticed something eerie. The overall pattern of brain case shape shifted, ever so slightly, toward a more Neanderthal-like outline. Not enough to see in the mirror, not enough for anyone to point at your silhouette and say, "Ah, there it is," but enough to show up in statistics, enough to suggest that some of the genes which once helped shape Neanderthal skulls are still doing quiet work inside modern heads. Other variants have been tied to the organization of the cerebral cortex itself, how different regions divide up tasks like integrating sensory information, managing attention, or planning complex actions. In some datasets, Neanderthal segments appear overrepresented in regions involved in visual processing and spatial navigation. In others, they seem connected to networks that regulate mood and internal thought, and that's where the story takes an even more intimate turn. Because when geneticists overlay these Neanderthal-derived variants with massive health databases, where volunteers have logged everything from their medical history to their mental health, they find more than just differences in skull shape. They find associations with how people feel. Some Neanderthal DNA fragments show up slightly more often in people diagnosed with major depression. Others correlate with higher risk for nicotine addiction, or with measures of mood instability and anxiety. A few seem tied to sensitivity to pain, or to how strongly people respond to stress. On paper, the effect sizes are small. No single Neanderthal variant decides your fate, but they act like weights on a scale. Add enough of certain types, combine them with your environment and personal history, and the balance can tilt. Why would this be? One idea is that many of these risky variants were once helpful. Imagine Neanderthals in Ice Age Europe facing constant low-level threat. Predators, unstable climate, harsh winters, potential conflict with neighbouring groups. In that context, a nervous system that stays on high alert might be adaptive. Individuals whose brains fired up quickly in response to ambiguous danger, rustling in the dark, a strange smell on the wind, could have been more likely to survive. Genes that make you more sensitive to threat, more easily aroused into vigilance, more reactive to social rejection or resource loss, might, in that world, be advantages. They could tighten group cohesion. They could encourage caution. They could make individuals more determined to seek out food, warmth, and security. Now transpose those same traits into a modern city. The predators are gone. The winters are centrally heated. The rustling in the dark is your neighbour's washing machine. But the machinery of your emotional brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, may still be tuned to a different world. Chronic stress, social media, economic uncertainty, disrupted sleep, all of it can whip that ancient system into overdrive. What once felt like adaptive vigilance becomes anxiety. What once sharpened focus in crises becomes rumination and depression when there's no clear enemy to fight or flee. The same logic may apply to addiction. Some Neanderthal variants are associated with changes in dopamine signaling, the brain's reward and motivation system. In sparse environments, where high-calorie foods and rare pleasures were hard to find, a brain that powerfully reinforced successful hunting, social bonding, or exploration could be life-saving. Strong reward signals would push you to repeat beneficial behaviors, but in a modern environment saturated with cheap, potent rewards, nicotine, alcohol, processed sugar, recreational drugs, endless digital stimulation, those same circuits can grab onto new targets. What was once a survival engine becomes vulnerability. Of course, this is just one interpretation. Another is that many of these statistical links are exactly that. Statistics. Correlations washed up by huge data sets that may or may not reflect anything biologically meaningful. When you test millions of variants against hundreds of traits, some associations will appear by chance alone. Even careful corrections can't catch every false signal. And even when the signal is real, its meaning is slippery. If a Neanderthal-derived variant is associated with both increased creativity and increased risk of bipolar disorder, what story do we tell? Is it a mental illness gene, a creativity gene, a Neanderthal gene, Or is it simply a small tweak to neural plasticity or emotional intensity that plays out differently depending on upbringing, culture, and chance? This is where scientists disagree most fiercely. Some argue that these Neanderthal brain-related variants are crucial to understanding why modern human populations differ, on average, in their susceptibility to certain psychiatric conditions. Others caution that we're still staring at shadows on the wall, interpreting blurry outlines as faces. The sample sizes, while large, are not infinite. The people who volunteer for brain imaging and genetic studies are not perfectly representative of the world. The ways we define depression, anxiety, and addiction are cultural, changing, and often imprecise. Our tools, MRI scans, psychological questionnaires, statistical models, are coarse instruments trying to measure something as delicate as a flicker of worry in the mind, and yet the pattern keeps reappearing. When independent teams use different methods in different populations, they often find echoes of the same story. Some Neanderthal variants are overrepresented in pathways involved in brain development, synaptic function, and neurotransmitter balance. They seem to have modest but real effects on temperament, stress reactivity, and vulnerability to mental health conditions. So we're left on a threshold. On one side, hard data, DNA sequences, skull measurements, brain scans, p-values. On the other, deep uncertainty about what any of it actually means for the private world inside your head. It's possible that years from now, we'll look back at the current wave of Neanderthal brain gene studies and see them as overhyped. An early clumsy attempt to connect ancient DNA to complex behavior. We may discover that many of these variants have tiny, context-dependent effects that wash out at the level of individual lives. It's also possible that we're only seeing the first hints of a profound truth, that our emotional lives are in part a negotiated compromise between multiple human species, that the way you respond to loss, or delight, or boredom, or fear is being nudged by genetic scripts written in caves and valleys long erased from the map. Either way, it raises a haunting question. When you feel a deep, unnameable sadness for no obvious reason, when your thoughts loop in circles late at night, when you find certain substances almost irresistibly compelling while others leave you cold, how much of that is you, and how much is a mosaic of ancestors, some of whom were not even Homo sapiens? There is no clean line separating their minds from yours. Neanderthals grieved, hunted, planned, loved, feared. Their brains were not broken versions of ours. They were solutions to a different equation. When our species met theirs and interbred, those solutions didn't vanish. They were folded into a new, unstable mixture. You are that mixture. Right now, lying in the dark, your thoughts drifting, your mood shading one way or another, signals are flowing through networks shaped by millions of years of evolution, including the 400,000 or so years when Neanderthals walked the earth. Some are the receptors those signals bind to, some are the channels they flow through, some are the scaffolding that hold your cortex in its particular shape, are built from instructions that once lived only in Neanderthal bodies. We don't yet know exactly what that means. We can't point to anyone feeling and say, that was theirs. We can't trace a single memory or dream back to an archaic source. The science isn't there, and it may never be. The brain is too complex, consciousness too emergent, history too tangled. But we can say this much. Extinct human DNA is not just in your bones and skin. It's in your nervous system, in the timing of your thoughts, in the subtle biases of your perception, in the way your inner weather shifts from calm to storm and back again. The Neanderthals died out. Their minds did not disappear. They dissolved into ours. And in the half-awake hours, when your attention wanders and your sense of self loosens, you might be closer than you realize to that ancient inheritance, thinking in your own way, with a brain partly shaped by people who have been gone for 40,000 years. If so much of their mind survived inside ours, there's an obvious question hiding in the background. What didn't survive? Because the story you usually hear, modern humans carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, can be quietly misleading. It makes it sound as if that number has been stable since the day the first hybrids were born, as if our ancestors took in a tidy slice of Neanderthal genome and then just kept it. The genetics tells a very different story. When scientists reconstruct those first generations of hybrids, using computer models and the patchwork of archaic DNA still stitched through modern genomes, they land on a higher number, not 1 or 2%, something closer to 10, even 20% in some early populations. In other words, when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals first interbred, the children of those unions were not a little bit Neanderthal. They were heavily Neanderthal genetically speaking. Their chromosomes were long unbroken stretches of Neanderthal sequence, braided together with Homo sapiens code. Across many generations, those stretches should have been chopped up into smaller and smaller pieces as DNA shuffled each time parents passed genes to offspring. But the total Neanderthal proportion on average should have stayed roughly the same, unless something else was happening. Something did happen. When researchers map where Neanderthal DNA sits in the modern human genome, they don't see a smooth, even sprinkling. They see islands and deserts, patches of high Neanderthal ancestry next to vast stretches where Neanderthal sequences are almost completely missing. Those empty stretches are called Neanderthal deserts. They're not random. They cluster around some of the most sensitive real estate in our genomes, regions involved in brain development, hormone signaling, reproduction, and the early stages of embryonic growth. The implication is hard to avoid. Once Neanderthal DNA entered our lineage, natural selection started pruning it back. Not gently, not passively, but in a focused, sustained way. Imagine those early mixed groups living side by side. Some individuals carrying more Neanderthal segments in certain critical regions, others less. If particular combinations cause trouble, developmental issues, lower fertility, subtle cognitive problems, those individuals would, on average, have had fewer surviving children. Over thousands of years, generation after generation, those problematic Neanderthal stretches would be slowly, relentlessly removed from the population. This is why, out of the original flood of Neanderthal genes, we're left with a trickle. You can see the scars of this process in a very specific place, the sex chromosomes. The X chromosome, passed from mothers to both sons and daughters, and from fathers to daughters, has far less Neanderthal DNA than the rest of the genome. In some sections, it's almost completely barren of archaic variants. That pattern hints at one particular vulnerability: male fertility. In mammals, males have one X chromosome and one Y. That makes males especially sensitive to harmful variants on the X, because there's no backup copy to mask the effect. If Neanderthal-derived sequences on the X chromosome caused even moderate problems for hybrid males, slightly lower sperm count, reduced motility, developmental glitches in the testes, those males would have left fewer offspring. Over time, that's enough to scrub many Neanderthal segments off the X chromosome almost entirely. This is the hybrid male infertility hypothesis. We see analogues of it in other species. When closely related species interbreed, different kinds of mice for example, the male hybrids are often the ones with reproductive trouble. Their sperm are misshapen, or they produce fewer viable gametes, or their testicular tissue develops abnormally. The females can be relatively fine, but the males pay the price of genetic mismatch. In humans, we can't go back and measure the sperm of Neanderthal Homo sapiens hybrids, but the pattern in our DNA looks eerily similar to what you'd expect if those first mixed sons were at a disadvantage. It doesn't stop at the X chromosome. When geneticists look at where Neanderthal DNA is underrepresented, they find another telling theme: genes that are heavily expressed in the testes and genes that are highly active in the brain. Both categories, reproduction and cognition, seem to have been especially hostile territory for Neanderthal sequences. Tests-expressed genes are often involved in delicate, rapidly evolving processes: sperm formation, hormone regulation, the choreography of meiosis where chromosomes are split and recombined. These genes can change quickly over evolutionary time as different populations adapt to different mating systems, environmental pressures, or pathogen landscapes. Drop in an alternate version from a sister species, and the machinery may still function, but not quite as well. A slightly higher rate of errors, a small decrease in fertility, enough over evolutionary time to be noticed by natural selection. Brain-expressed genes are different, but just as unforgiving. Many of the genes that sculpt the developing brain are deeply conserved and exquisitely tuned. They regulate when neurons divide and when they stop, how they migrate to their final positions, how they extend their axons to connect with distant partners. Even a tiny change in timing or dosage can ripple outward, altering brain structure, connectivity, and function. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens had drifted apart in how they wired certain circuits, especially those involved in language, social cognition, or learning, then mixing these genetic programs could have produced subtle mismatches. Not catastrophes, necessarily, but slight disadvantages in a world where every bit of cognitive efficiency mattered. Over long stretches of time, those mismatch combinations would have been gently filtered out. The result is what we see today: a human genome that still carries Neanderthal instructions for things like skin pigmentation, immune defense, lipid metabolism, but has purged most of the Neanderthal code from the most sensitive control panels of mind and reproduction. Certain regions involved in synapse formation, neurotransmitter balance, and cortical development show deep Neanderthal deserts. Others carry only rare, fragile islands of archaic sequence, like the last traces of an erased text. None of this means Neanderthals were genetically inferior. It means they were specialized. Their genomes had been shaped by hundreds of thousands of years in Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. Ours had been shaped in Africa under different climates, different pathogens, different social and ecological pressures. Each lineage was a locally optimized solution. When those solutions met in a single body, some pieces slotted together well, others jammed. The fact that we retain any Neanderthal DNA at all tells us that much of it was compatible, or even beneficial, when plugged into a Homo sapiens background. Some variants clearly helped with immune defense, cold tolerance, and adaptation to new environments, but the regions where Neanderthal DNA is conspicuously absent tell a quieter, more fragile story about what it takes to keep a brain working smoothly, or a reproductive system running at full strength when you splice together two evolutionary trajectories. You can think of it as a negotiation written in genes. Every generation after that first contact, the genomes of mixed individuals were in effect asking, which parts of this Neanderthal inheritance can we keep, and which parts are too costly? The answer was not decided by any one mind, but by differential survival and reproduction, playing out silently over millennia. We live with the outcome of that negotiation. In your DNA, there are stretches where Neanderthal sequences stick out like old stones in a modern wall, and there are long corridors where their presence has been almost entirely erased, as if someone carefully sanded away every trace of a previous inscription. Those absences are as revealing as the fragments that remain. They whisper that the boundary between species is not a brick wall, but it isn't a smooth slide either. It's a rough, uneven landscape where some paths are easy, others treacherous, and some are blocked entirely. Our ancestors walked that landscape generation by generation without understanding what they were doing. They just lived, loved, raised children, and buried their dead. Natural selection did the bookkeeping for them. It kept the Neanderthal genes that played nicely with ours, and it quietly, ruthlessly let the others vanish. The negotiation didn't end in the Ice Age. It's still going on. It just changed battlefields. For most of human history, the fiercest tests of our genes were things like starvation, parasites, and sudden injuries. A bad cut could kill you. A winter without enough fat stored away could wipe out your children. A new pathogen sweeping through a small band could erase an entire bloodline. Natural selection wrote its opinions about our DNA in those moments. But every so often, something happens that lets us read those old decisions in real time. That happened in 2020. When the first wave of COVID-19 began crashing across the world, scientists were scrambling not just to understand the virus, but to answer a quieter, more unsettling question. Why did the same virus leave some people with nothing more than a mild cough, and send others into intensive care gasping for air? Age mattered. So did pre-existing conditions. But even after accounting for those, there were patterns that didn't quite make sense. Whole families hit hard. Others, just as exposed, barely affected. So researchers turned to the genome. They launched massive studies comparing the DNA of people who had severe COVID, hospitalized, on ventilators, sometimes dead, to the DNA of those who tested positive but recovered at home with relatively mild symptoms. And then, on chromosome 3, they found something strange. A cluster of genes inherited together like a tightly bound package kept lighting up in the data. People who carried this particular segment were significantly more likely to develop life-threatening COVID if they got infected. Not a small increase. In some analyses, roughly double the risk of needing intensive care. When geneticists zoomed in and compared the sequence to known reference genomes, they felt an unsettling jolt of recognition. That dangerous segment on chromosome 3 was Neanderthal. Not just kind of similar to Neanderthal, nearly identical to a stretch of DNA recovered from Neanderthal remains dated to around 50,000 years ago. In other words, one of the strongest genetic risk factors for severe COVID-19 in the 21st century came directly from interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals in the late Pleistocene. So what does that gene cluster actually do? It's not one gene, but a small neighborhood of them, sitting close enough together that they tend to travel as a unit from parent to child. Several are involved in orchestrating immune responses, especially the early frantic stage when your body first realizes something is wrong and releases chemical signals to call in reinforcements. Under normal circumstances, that early alarm system is your friend. It tells nearby cells to lock their doors. It summons white blood cells to the site of infection. It ramps up inflammation to create a hostile environment for invaders. But like any alarm, it can be too loud. In severe COVID, many patients don't just die because the virus damages their lungs. They die because their own immune system overreacts. The body unleashes a storm of inflammatory signals that start damaging tissues everywhere. Lungs, blood vessels, even the heart and brain. That Neanderthal-derived segment on chromosome 3 seems to push the dial toward a more aggressive response. In some ancient context, that may have been a lifesaver. A pathogen so fast and brutal that only the most explosive immune reaction could stop it before it spread. In a world of small, scattered bands, a gene that helped your immune system go nuclear might mean the difference between a local outbreak and the extinction of your entire group. In a world of ventilators and ICU wards, that same hair-trigger response can be deadly. This is the dark side of evolutionary success. A variant that once helped our ancestors survive some forgotten epidemic in some Ice Age valley can turn into a liability when the rules of the game change. The story doesn't stop at biology. It leaves fingerprints on the map. When researchers looked at where this Neanderthal risk haplotype, this bundle package on chromosome 3, shows up in modern populations, they found a very uneven pattern. It's rare in Africa. That makes sense because most African populations have relatively little Neanderthal ancestry overall, but in South Asia, especially in parts of Bangladesh and neighbouring regions, it can be found in more than 30% of people. Across Europe and the Americas, where many people have mixed ancestry, smaller but still substantial fractions carry at least one copy. This doesn't mean that geography alone decided who got sick. Pandemics are shaped by politics, poverty, healthcare systems, chance. But in the background, quietly, this 50,000-year-old genetic inheritance was nudging probabilities. In places where the Neanderthal haplotype is common, more people carried a latent vulnerability, one that only revealed itself when a very specific new virus appeared. It's like discovering that your neighbourhood was unknowingly built on an ancient fault line, and only noticing when the earth finally shakes. But the Neanderthal legacy in COVID isn't purely a story of risk. When scientists kept digging, they found something more complicated and strangely symmetrical. Elsewhere in the genome, other Neanderthal-derived variants seemed to do the opposite. They were associated with a reduced risk of severe COVID, or with a slightly better chance of staying out of the hospital altogether. Some of these protective segments influenced immune pathways in more subtle ways, modulating inflammatory responses or antiviral defenses. Others touched on genes involved in recognizing viral particles and clearing them efficiently before they could gain a foothold. One Neanderthal variant appeared to help with the early viral sensing in the respiratory tract, an advantage when facing a brand new respiratory pathogen. Another was linked to more controlled inflammation, reining in the risk of runaway immune storms that cause lasting damage. The picture that emerges is not one of a simple curse or blessing, it's a mosaic. From Neanderthals, we inherited both shields and weaknesses. Some archaic immune tweaks arm us against certain infections. Others leave us exposed to rare, specific threats that didn't exist or didn't matter in the Pleistocene, and we usually don't know which is which until history tests them. What makes the COVID connection so haunting is the timescale. A virus that likely jumped into humans sometime in the late 2000s collided with patterns of genetic variation shaped by encounters between two human species tens of thousands of years ago. The lovers who met in some cold valley in Eurasia, who shared a fire and a language we can no longer hear, had children. Those children had their own children, and on through ice ages and interglacials, plagues and famines, wars and migrations. Their genetic legacy drifted across continents, mixed into new populations, lay dormant. Then, in hospitals lit by fluorescent bulbs, among humming machines and beeping monitors, that legacy suddenly mattered again. The way a patient's lungs responded, how their blood vessels handled inflammation, whether their immune system slammed the brakes in time. A 50,000-year-old inheritance influencing the outcome of a 21st century pandemic. It's a reminder that evolution doesn't have foresight. It doesn't plan for ventilators or antibiotics or global travel. It only shapes genes to fit the world of the moment. If that world is full of unfamiliar Ice Age pathogens, certain immune configurations will be favoured. If that world is a tightly connected planet where a new virus can circle the globe in months, the same configurations might become vulnerabilities. We live at the intersection of these mismatched timescales, ancient adaptations, modern environments. The Neanderthal segments in our genomes are not mistakes. They are relics of real victories against real dangers that our ancestors faced. They helped someone survive long enough to have children in a world that has almost entirely vanished. But their effects now are unpredictable. A gene that once guarded against some prehistoric respiratory infection might magnify the risk from a novel coronavirus. Another that bolstered immunity against a Pleistocene parasite might quietly help a modern patient shrug off a pandemic. We're used to thinking of ancestry as a story told in faces, in surnames, in family trees. COVID-19 revealed another layer: ancestry as an invisible set of probabilities that only show themselves under extreme stress. As if the past occasionally taps the present on the shoulder and says, "You thought we were done? Not yet." The Neanderthal contribution to this pandemic is not the whole story, but it's a stark example of a deeper truth. When you look at your genome, you're not just seeing a record of where your ancestors came from. You're seeing a library of the old solutions, carried forward into a world their creators could never have imagined. Some of those solutions still fit perfectly. Some fit awkwardly. Some sit quietly for tens of thousands of years, waiting for the day when a new virus, with a new shape and a new strategy, finally turns them back on. The Neanderthal story alone would be strange enough. But our DNA holds another secret. Because when scientists first started scanning modern genomes for Neanderthal segments, they kept bumping into something that didn't quite fit. Sequences that were clearly not modern human, but also not Neanderthal. They didn't match any reference in the fossil record. It was as if there was a second ancient stranger living inside us. A ghost no one had ever met. The first real clue surfaced in a place that barely deserves to be called a cave. High in the Altai mountains of Siberia, there's a small, unassuming rock shelter called Denisova Cave. Archaeologists had been digging there for years, finding stone tools and the occasional fragment of bone. Neanderthals had clearly lived there at some point. So had early modern humans. In 2008, a tiny finger bone turned up. It belonged to a child, probably a girl, who lived there around 50,000 to 80,000 years ago. It was so small that for a while it just sat in a collection box. Too fragmentary to tell much from the shape alone. Not obviously Neanderthal, not obviously modern human, just another scrap from a long-vanished life. Then someone decided to sequence its DNA. What came back stunned the field. The mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line, was deeply divergent. Not Neanderthal, not Homo sapiens, something else. When scientists sequenced the nuclear genome, the verdict became inescapable. This child belonged to a sister species of Neanderthals, closely related but genetically distinct, a lineage that had split off hundreds of thousands of years earlier and gone its own way somewhere in Asia. They named them after the cave where that small finger rested for tens of thousands of years. Denisovans. We have almost no skeletons, no complete skull, no clear picture of their faces. For years, Denisovans were known mainly from that finger bone, a few teeth, and later a fragment of skull. But their genetic shadow is enormous, because when researchers compared Denisovan DNA to modern populations, they found something even stranger than with Neanderthals. In most Europeans, Denisovan ancestry is minimal, a trace at best. But in parts of Asia, and especially among the ancestors of Pacific Islanders and indigenous Australians, Denisovan DNA is everywhere. If your family roots run through places like Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, parts of the Philippines, or the highlands of Melanesia, you may carry up to 5% Denisovan ancestry. That's not subtle. That's the echo of a real encounter, repeated encounters, between our species and theirs. Picture it. Modern humans spreading east out of Africa and the Middle East, moving through South Asia, sweeping along the coasts, island hopping, following river valleys, and waiting out there, already established across huge parts of Asia, are these other humans. Not Neanderthals this time. They're cousins, Denisovans. We don't know what their languages sounded like. We don't know how they dressed, what myths they told, how they organized their families. But we know that when our ancestors met them, they didn't just compete. They lived together long enough to have children. Those children were mixed, half Denisovan, half Homo sapiens. Their descendants spread outward, generation after generation carrying fragments of Denisovan genomes with them. Pieces of a vanished species woven into the fabric of living people. Some of those pieces turned out to be astonishingly useful. High on the Tibetan plateau, life takes place in thin air. Oxygen levels are low. For people not adapted to it, high altitude is exhausting at best, lethal at worst. You can't get enough oxygen into your blood. Your heart and lungs strain. Your body starts to break down. Yet for tens of thousands of years, humans have lived there. When geneticists looked at what allowed Tibetans to thrive at altitudes that leave most lowlanders gasping, one gene kept standing out: EPAS1. EPAS1 helps regulate your response to low oxygen. In most people, if you climb quickly to high altitude, your body reacts by ramping up red blood cell production, thickening the blood. It's a crude workaround, helpful in the short term, dangerous if pushed too far. Tibetans, though, have a version of EPAS1 that lets their bodies handle low oxygen without going into that overdrive. Their blood doesn't thicken as much. Their systems stay more stable. It's a finely tuned adaptation to life in the sky. When scientists traced the origin of this special EPAS1 variant, it led to a familiar surprise. It didn't come from other Tibetans. It didn't arise independently in our species. Its closest match was found in Denisovans. Some ancient encounter, probably somewhere in Central or East Asia, brought modern humans and Denisovans together. They had children. Those children carried the Denisovan-style EPAS1 gene. In most places, it didn't matter much. The gene drifted in and out of lineages, one more variant among many. But on the high plateau, where oxygen was scarce and winters were brutal, that particular version became a lifeline. People who had it could survive pregnancies at altitude, raise healthier children, work and travel without collapsing. Natural selection did the rest. Over thousands of years, the Denisovan EPAS1 variant spread through Tibetan populations until it became almost universal. Today, it's one of the clearest examples we have of a human group quite literally borrowing survival technology from another species. A ghost species, guiding blood and breath in a place they no longer exist. And EPAS1 is not the only case. As researchers comb through genomes from across Asia and Oceania, they keep finding Denisovan fingerprints tied to immune function, fat metabolism, and perhaps even dental and skeletal traits. In island populations of Southeast Asia, Denisovan segments seem to touch on how bodies handle heat, humidity, and certain local pathogens. Layer that on top of the Neanderthal contributions, and the picture starts to look less like a simple branching tree and more like a braided river. Evolutionary diagrams often show species splitting neatly. One line becomes two, those become four, and so on. But the more we learn, the more that image falls apart for our own lineage. Instead of clean separations, we see splits followed by reconnections. Modern humans diverge from the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans. Later, Neanderthals and Denisovans split from each other. Later still, all three meet again, at different times, in different places, and their genes mix back together. The lines don't just fork and end, they cross, they loop, they feed back into each other. A child in a Siberian cave turns out to have had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, an actual first-generation hybrid. Other Denisovan genomes show traces of even older, more mysterious ancestry, as if they too had interbred with some earlier, unknown hominins in Asia. When scientists model modern genomes using only known lineages, modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, the numbers still don't quite add up. There are fragments, especially in parts of Africa and Asia, that look archaic but don't match any known reference. The simplest explanation is also the strangest. There were other kinds of humans out there, other populations that left their mark in our DNA but didn't leave enough bones for us to recognize them. Ghost lineages, as geneticists sometimes call them. entire branches of the human story that we only glimpse as statistical anomalies in big data sets. Somewhere in your genome, there may be a short stretch, just a few thousand bases long, that doesn't trace cleanly back to Homo sapiens, or Neanderthals, or Denisovans, a relic from a people we haven't even named yet. All of this complicates the idea of pure ancestry. There is no single, unbroken line that leads cleanly from some ancient Adam and Eve to you. Instead, your genome is a patchwork quilt stitched together from encounters across deep time. Neanderthal hunters in icebound valleys, Denisovan families in Asian forests and mountain passes, other hominins lost to the fossil record but not entirely lost to memory because their genes still whisper inside our cells. When you take a deep breath at sea level, your lungs fill easily, and it feels unremarkable. On the Tibetan plateau, that same breath carries the legacy of a Denisovan variant that makes life possible at 4,000 meters. When your immune system recognizes a pathogen it has never seen before, part of that recognition may come from defenses inherited from Neanderthals, or from some older, stranger source. Our species didn't rise in splendid isolation. We negotiated our place in the world in conversation with other humans, some like us, some very different, exchanging not just tools and stories, but chromosomes. The Denisovan twist in this story is a reminder that the past isn't neatly archived. It's entangled with the present, woven right into our physiology. And it raises a quieter, more unsettling thought. If we can still find Neanderthal and Denisovan traces in modern genomes, and if the data hint at other unnamed contributors, how many human stories have we lost entirely? How many faces, languages, myths, and ways of living vanished from the earth, leaving behind nothing but a few useful genes that happen to catch a ride into the future? Some of those genes are in you. You are, in a very literal sense, the meeting place of species. And yet, for all this mixing, one branch did something none of the others managed. One lineage didn't just survive alongside its cousins, it outlasted them. We know roughly when the Neanderthal line as a separate people fades from view. In Europe and Western Asia, their last clear traces cluster around 40,000 years ago. A little earlier in some regions, a little later in others. After more than 300,000 years of calling Ice Age Europe home, the record thins, and then it's gone. Stone tools that are unmistakably Neanderthal stop appearing. Their distinctive skeletons vanish from the layers of sediment. Caves they once occupied are suddenly filled only with the remains of our own species, and for a long time that raised a simple, brutal question. What happened to them? For most of the 20th century, the story was written like a conquest myth. Modern humans, armed with superior brains and culture, march out of Africa. They meet Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe. There is conflict. One species wins, the other is wiped out. A clean replacement, a singular victory. The more we've learned, the less that story fits. The timing alone is suspicious. Neanderthals had weathered hundreds of thousands of years of ice and thaw, volcanic winters, shifting animal herds. They survived eruptions larger than anything humans have ever recorded in writing. They rode out climate swings that turned forest to steppe and back again. And then, within a few thousand years of our arrival in their core territories, they're gone. Not overnight, but fast in evolutionary terms. So what actually happened in that brief, tangled window between first contact and final disappearance? There are a few main suspects. The first is simple competition. By the time Homo sapiens reached Europe in significant numbers, we weren't the fragile bottleneck survivors anymore. We were tool makers, long-distance traders, storytellers. We organized in larger, more flexible social networks. We could move information about animals, plants, weather, danger, farther and faster than any humans before us. If Neanderthals lived mostly in small scattered bands, separated by long distances, then every famine, every bad winter, every outbreak of disease hit them harder. When a group collapsed, there were fewer neighbours to help. Our ancestors, with denser networks and longer-range connections, could move resources and people around more efficiently. A band hit by disaster might be absorbed into another. Ideas for better hunting or new foods could spread across hundreds of kilometres within a few generations. You don't need anyone to pick up a spear and declare war for that kind of difference to matter. All you need is slightly higher survival and slightly higher birth rates in one population than the other. Over a few centuries, the advantage is small. Over a few thousand years, it's decisive. Archaeology hints at this kind of quiet, relentless pressure. As modern humans spread through Europe, we see dense sites with high artifact counts, evidence of larger group sizes, broader diets that include more plants, fish, small game. Neanderthal sites, even late ones, often look more focused. Spectacular big game hunting, but a narrower overall toolkit. In a changing climate, specialization is risky. Flexibility wins. Then there's the climate itself. Around the time Neanderthals disappear, Europe's environment is swinging wildly. Not a simple trend toward cold, but rapid lurches between bitter glacial phases and brief, warmer interludes. Forests advance, then retreat. Animal communities reshuffle. For a species tuned to a particular mix of cold steppe, forests and megafauna, that shifting mosaic could be deadly. Some researchers argue that Neanderthals were already in trouble before we arrived. Their total numbers might have been low, their range patchy. Genetic studies suggest that by the end, many Neanderthal communities were small and inbred, with signs of reduced diversity. That's almost always a red flag in population biology. Low genetic diversity means fewer ways for natural selection to find solutions to new problems. Diseases can spread more easily. Random strokes of bad luck, an avalanche, a bad hunting season, a local epidemic, can wipe out whole lineages without leaving many relatives behind to carry on. Into that fragile system step modern humans. We don't just bring new tools and social structures, we bring our own parasites, bacteria and viruses, pathogens Neanderthals may never have encountered before. Their immune systems, tuned over millennia to their local microbial world, suddenly face foreign invaders. Some scientists think diseases carried by our species could have hit Neanderthals hard, just as old-world pathogens devastated indigenous populations in the Americas after European contact. Not because anyone intended it, but because biology is indifferent to intention. Did war play a role? That's the darker question. Popular imagination loves the image of Neanderthals and modern humans locked in brutal combat, species against species. And it's not impossible that conflicts occurred. Two kinds of humans, hunting similar animals, using similar shelters, converging on the same rivers and valleys. It would be surprising if there were never clashes. There are Neanderthal bones with trauma, skull fractures, broken ribs. Some look like hunting accidents or falls. A few could be the result of interpersonal violence. But there is no clear archaeological layer of slaughter. No unmistakable massacre sites where Neanderthals were systematically exterminated by sapiens. The genocide hypothesis makes for dramatic storytelling, but the evidence is thin. What we see instead is messier. Long periods of overlap, zones of contact, and, crucially, interbreeding. Because if one species was bent on erasing the other, they did a terrible job of avoiding its bed. The genomes of living people outside Africa almost all carry Neanderthal segments. That means that while Neanderthal population numbers were declining, they were also sharing genes with our ancestors. Which brings us to another possibility: absorption. Imagine a Europe where Neanderthals are few, their bands small, their hunting grounds under pressure. Modern human groups, more numerous and better connected, begin to occupy nearby territories. Maybe at first they mostly avoid each other, then they trade, then in some places they share hearths. A Neanderthal woman joins a human band, or vice versa. Their children grow up speaking their mother's language, their father's language, or something between. As generations pass, those children marry mostly into the more numerous population. Their Neanderthal identity, whatever it meant, slowly dilutes into a broader human community. From the point of view of bones and artifacts, Neanderthals disappear. From the point of view of DNA, they're still there, just scattered, fragmented, embedded inside a different cultural package. Genetic models suggest that even a relatively small amount of interbreeding, spread out over a few thousand years, can leave the level of Neanderthal ancestry we see today, while still allowing Neanderthals as a distinct self-recognizing group to vanish. Not because they were all killed, but because they were, in a sense, swallowed. Even that, though, doesn't mean Neanderthals and modern humans were equal partners in some peaceful merger. Power imbalances, resource stress, and outright violence could all have shaped those encounters. Some matings were probably consensual, others almost certainly were not. What we can say, with some confidence, is that no single cause explains their end. Competition, climate volatility, small population size, low genetic diversity, possible disease burdens and gene flow into our species, all of these likely intertwined. By 40,000 years ago, the world had changed. The networks that had sustained Neanderthal life for hundreds of millennia were fraying. Our own networks were expanding. In ecology, when two closely related species compete for the same niche, it's rare for them to coexist indefinitely if one has even a slight edge. Over time, one tends to shrink back or vanish. Neanderthals didn't have anywhere left to shrink to, and yet, if you look at the story the way your cells tell it, they never quite left. Every time your immune system rallies against a novel virus, there's a chance a Neanderthal-derived gene is helping coordinate the response. Every time your skin tans or freckle patterns appear after summer sun, you may be seeing the legacy of adaptations that first evolved under glacial skies. Even elements of your sleep cycle, your mood regulation, your risk of certain diseases carry echoes of people who once stalked mammoth through frozen valleys. So did Neanderthals go extinct? In the strict taxonomic sense, yes. There are no communities today that are culturally Neanderthal, no bands of robust, broad-faced hunters living apart from us in some hidden valley. But at the genetic level, extinction is not a clean erasure, it's a handing off, a long relay across time in which some lineages end as names in textbooks, and others continue as subtle patterns of nucleotides inside the cells of a completely different-looking species. Somewhere in your genome, a stretch of DNA once sat in the bones of a Neanderthal child, buried with care in a cave on a cold hillside 45,000 years ago. Her people are gone. But a sliver of her, carried forward through thousands of births, is alive whenever you breathe, sleep, dream. Which leaves us with one more question. If so much of them lives on in us, and if our own ancestry is such a tangle of vanished cousins and ghost lineages, what else is hiding there? What are the ancient gifts and ancient curses coded in those borrowed genes that science still doesn't fully understand? There are some pieces of this story that line up neatly. We can trace specific Neanderthal genes that help modern immune systems recognize viruses. We can point to variants that affect how our skin handles weak northern sunlight. We can even connect certain Neanderthal stretches of DNA to how our internal clocks respond to long winter nights. Useful, concrete, measurable. But once you zoom out from those clear cases, the picture gets strangely murky. Because much of the Neanderthal DNA inside you does, Nothing obvious. It just sits there, not clearly beneficial, not clearly harmful, not tied to some dramatic trait we can point to and say, "Ah, that's what they gave us." Geneticists can scan your genome, highlight the regions that almost certainly came from Neanderthals, and then stare at long sequences of code that refuse to explain themselves. Some of these segments fall in what used to be called junk DNA, non-coding regions that don't build proteins at all. For decades, these stretches were treated like evolutionary clutter. Now we know they can regulate when and where genes turn on, fine-tuning the orchestra rather than playing a single instrument, but we still don't know what the Neanderthal notes in the orchestra are actually doing. Why did natural selection keep them? One possibility is that many Neanderthal variants are just neutral. They slipped into our gene pool through interbreeding and neither helped nor hurt enough to be weeded out. In a big, rapidly expanding population like ours, neutral passengers can ride along for a very long time. Another possibility is more unsettling. Some of those sequences might matter, but only under conditions we haven't fully tested. A certain Neanderthal variant might change stress responses not in the lab, but during famine. Another might alter disease risk only when combined with modern diets, artificial light, or sedentary lifestyles. Things no Neanderthal genome was ever built to handle. We may be carrying genetic tools designed for an ice age that now quietly misfire in a world of screens, cities, and night shift jobs. There's another layer of mystery, one that stretches across the map of our species. Not everyone carries Neanderthal DNA to the same degree, or in the same places of the genome. People whose recent ancestry is from sub-Saharan Africa tend to have very little Neanderthal genetic material, because their ancestors mostly stayed in Africa, where Neanderthals never lived. Populations from Europe, the Middle East and South Asia often carry around 2% Neanderthal ancestry. Some East Asian populations seem to carry a bit more. At first glance, that pattern seems straightforward. More overlap in time and space, more interbreeding. But when researchers zoom in on which exact Neanderthal segments different populations carry, things get confusing. Some groups share the same Neanderthal-derived variants. Others have entirely different Neanderthal fragments in the very same genomic neighborhood. It's as if multiple, separate encounters layered over each other, a tangle of meetings, matings, and migrations. Why did certain Neanderthal segments rise to high frequency in Tibetans, but remain rare elsewhere? Why do some indigenous American populations carry echoes of Neanderthal variants that seem to come through complex paths via ancient Siberian ancestors? And why does Europe, the old Neanderthal heartland, not always show the highest levels of Neanderthal DNA, despite being the place where our two species overlapped the longest? There are hypotheses. Maybe East Asian populations experienced additional waves of interbreeding with late Neanderthal groups. Maybe natural selection quietly removed certain Neanderthal variants in some regions but not others. Maybe demographic events, bottlenecks, founder effects, population crashes reshuffled the deck in ways we're only beginning to reconstruct. But we don't have a single tidy answer that ties it all up. In a sense, your genome is not just mixed with Neanderthal DNA. It's mixed with the history of countless encounters whose details have vanished. Alliances, rivalries, shared winters, children born at the borders between worlds. If the genetic puzzles are intricate, the cognitive ones are deeper still. We can measure Neanderthal skulls. We can estimate their brain volume, often slightly larger than ours. We can examine the regions of their brains that seem to have been emphasized, areas linked to motor control, spatial reasoning, possibly social cognition. We can look at their tools, their hearths, their burials, their pigments. We can infer a lot. But we have no way to know what it felt like to be a Neanderthal. Did they experience grief the way we do? Hope? Nostalgia? When they buried a child, tucking a body into the earth with care, did they imagine a spirit world? Or was it simply respect, a way of protecting the dead from scavengers? When a group sat around a fire after a successful hunt, did they tell structured stories, myths of origin, tales of heroes and monsters, or did they share something more immediate and practical? Where the herds had gone, where the rivers were changing course. We suspect they had language. The anatomy of their throat and ears suggests they could produce a wide range of sounds. The complexity of their cooperation in hunting and tool-making all but demands some form of spoken communication. But we don't know how rich that language was. Could they speak of yesterday and tomorrow, of what if, and once upon a time? Did they name the stars? We look for answers in stray clues, the pattern of wear on their teeth, chemical signatures in their bones that tell us what they ate, microscopic scratches suggesting they use their front teeth as a third hand to hold hides and fibres while working. All of that paints a picture of daily life. None of it opens the door into their inner life. Some neuroscientists and geneticists are trying anyway, in indirect ways. They compare Neanderthal DNA to ours, focusing on genes involved in brain development and synaptic function. They ask, if we swap a Neanderthal version of this gene into human cells in a dish, does it change how the neurons grow, how they connect, how they fire? Preliminary work hints at differences, subtle shifts in timing, in branching patterns, in networks of communication between cells. Not better or worse, but different developmental trajectories. We're a long way from knowing what those shifts meant for thoughts, for dreams, for consciousness. But it raises a haunting question. When you carry Neanderthal-derived variants that tweak brain development, how much of your own mental landscape is shaped by an extinct way of being human? And we're not done digging. Ancient DNA technology improves almost yearly. Where one Neanderthal genome once seemed like a miracle, we now have dozens, scattered across time and space. Denisovan DNA is beginning to resolve from a ghostly rumour into multiple distinct lineages. There are hints, still controversial, of other older ghost populations that left faint traces in our genomes without leaving a name in the fossil record. New caves are being excavated. Old museum bones are being re-examined with fresh methods. Sediments that once seemed mute are now revealing DNA fragments from long-vanished humans who passed through but left no skeletons behind. In the future, we may be able to map Neanderthal ancestry in your genome with almost cinematic precision, linking specific segments not just to Neanderthals, but to particular regions, particular time periods, maybe even particular subgroups with distinct cultures. We may find that what we call Neanderthal DNA is not one thing at all, but a mosaic of many Neanderthal peoples, each with their own histories. As that detail comes into focus, another kind of question looms, one less scientific and more philosophical. What does it mean to know you carry the DNA of an extinct human species? On one level, it's a technical curiosity, a few percent here, a few percent there. Small numbers in a genome that is, overwhelmingly, Homo sapiens. But on another level it blurs categories we like to keep sharp. We talk about us and them, modern humans and Neanderthals, separate species with separate fates. Yet in your cells, that line is not a border. It's a gradient. If some of your immune responses, some of your sleep patterns, some of your moods or vulnerabilities are shaped by Neanderthal variants, then your sense of self, your I, is already a collaboration between lineages. You're not a pure anything. You're a palimpsest, a manuscript written, erased, and written over again, with older ink still faintly visible beneath the newer lines. That realization pushes against our assumptions about uniqueness. We like to imagine our species as a singular breakthrough, the one animal that tells stories, makes art, contemplates the stars. But the more we learn, the more it looks as though many of the capacities we prize, tool-making, symbolism, complex social systems, perhaps even proto-language, were shared across multiple humankinds. Maybe we weren't the first to bury our dead with meaning. Maybe we weren't the first to sit awake at night, listening to the wind outside a cave, wondering what waited beyond the circle of firelight. Maybe we were just the ones whose particular combination of genes and cultures happened to survive. The Neanderthal DNA in your body is a quiet reminder of that contingency. It says, evolution is not a straight ladder with us at the top. It's a branching, tangled tree. Most branches end, a few merge. One, for now, continues. We stand on that living branch, looking back at the others, trying to reconstruct their shapes from scattered bones and lingering code. We can measure, model, and test. We can narrow down possibilities. We can even sometimes watch ancient genes flicker to life inside modern cells. But some questions may never be fully answered. We may never know the exact words of a Neanderthal lullaby, or whether they had lullabies at all. We may never know what they dreamed when they slept under auroras that lit up Ice Age skies. We may never know whether, in their last generations, they sensed that something in the world was tilting away from them. What we can know is that they are not wholly gone. They moved into us. Every heartbeat you feel, every breath you draw, runs through a body assembled from billions of years of life and millions of years of human evolution. Homo erectus, archaic Africans, ghost lineages, Denisovans, Neanderthals, and countless unnamed cousins, all whispering through your cells. Science can trace some of those whispers. Others remain for now a murmur at the edge of hearing, which leaves one final thought as you lie here, breathing slowly, when you fall asleep and your brain slips into the ancient rhythms of dreaming. How much of that journey belongs to you alone? And how much is an inheritance from people who walked the world long before human meant what it does today? Tonight, you started with a simple, almost childlike question tucked somewhere in the back of your mind. What exactly is living inside my cells? Maybe before this, Neanderthal was just a cartoon caveman in your imagination. A heavy brow, a club, a stereotype. Now, as you lie here, you know that for you, and for almost everyone listening who traces recent ancestry beyond Africa, that word is not just a picture in a textbook. It is part of your biology. Somewhere in the long code folded inside your chromosomes, there are lines of sequence that have no meaning without them. Stretches of DNA that were once carried in bodies that never saw a skyscraper, never heard a car, never knew that another world was coming. And yet here they are, working quietly in you. That realization changes the frame. You're not a single, seamless story that began and ended with modern humans. You're a mosaic, assembled from different humankinds. A living archive of experiments that evolution ran, some of which ended in extinction, but not before leaving a few pages of their story in us. It means that when we say Neanderthals disappeared, we have to add a gentle asterisk. Their culture vanished. Their languages, their songs, their particular ways of seeing the world are gone. But biologically they took another path. They became an influence diffused into our species, a faint but real presence in your immune system, in your skin, in the machinery that tells your brain when it's time to sleep or wake. Perhaps in subtle ways, in how your neurons talk to each other when you worry, or daydream, or fall in love. We like to draw clean lines around identity. This group, that group, this species, that species, us and them. Your genome doesn't respect those lines. It tells a different story, one in which us has always been porous, one in which belonging is not about purity, but about entanglement, about shared ancestors, shared crises, shared winters huddled around shared fires. If you zoom out far enough, every border we've ever drawn becomes blurry. Some of your genes come from people who never left Africa, others from wanderers who stepped into new continents and met Neanderthals in cold valleys or along stony coasts. Still others, if your ancestry passes through parts of Asia or Oceania, carry whispers from Denisovans and other ghost populations with no proper names. You're not just the descendant of one people. You are the meeting place of many, and so is almost everyone else. That's one of the quiet, unsettling, and strangely comforting implications of this whole story. The differences we fixate on, the colour of skin, the shape of eyes, the borders on maps, the languages we speak, are recent, superficial ripples on a very ancient shared ocean. Underneath, we're all the children of the same bottlenecks and the same expansions, the same narrow escapes from extinction, the same interwoven branches of the human family tree. Some of us carry more Neanderthal DNA, some less, some almost none at all. But the deeper truth is that every listener, wherever you are on Earth right now, shares most of your genome with every other. The small fraction that comes from Neanderthals or Denisovans or other archaic humans is layered on top of a vast common core. You're much more alike than different. Knowing that, identity becomes less about drawing lines and more about recognizing connections. The Neanderthal in you is a reminder that being human has never been a fixed category. It has always been a moving target, a conversation between lineages, a collaboration across time. As you listen, there are people hearing these same words in cities and villages, in apartments and dorm rooms and quiet houses, on islands and continents you may never visit. Different time zones, different languages, different lives. And yet many of you carry the same ancient fragments of DNA, the same bits of code that once helped someone survive an ice age night. You are separated by oceans and cultures, but linked by molecules that once flowed in the blood of an entirely different human species. If you feel like sharing, you can leave a comment with where you're listening from, your city, your country, or just the part of the world you call home. It's a small way of tracing in real time the global web that those ancient migrations eventually created. If you've enjoyed drifting through this story, through bottlenecks and glaciers, through caves and genomes, and you'd like to wander further into this kind of history, you can help keep the journey going. You can gently tap like or subscribe so you don't miss the next time we dig up something strange and beautiful from the past. If you feel like joining the conversation, you can leave your questions or thoughts below. What part of this story stayed with you? Was it the idea of ghost DNA, the uncertainty around Neanderthal minds, or the thought that your sleep might still be tuned to Ice Age rhythms? And if you want to support this channel a little more, there's also an optional membership here on YouTube. It's never required. These stories will still be here either way, but if you choose to join, it helps us spend more time researching, reading old papers, and turning dense science into something you can fall asleep to. For now, though, there is nothing you need to do. The day that brought you here is already behind you. Your eyes are growing heavier. Your breathing has settled into a slow, easy pattern. Inside you, cells are repairing, dividing, quietly reading from strands of DNA that remember things you do not. Some of those strands carry instructions refined in African refugees during ancient droughts. Some carry tweaks borrowed from Neanderthals who hunted under cold, pale suns. Some may even hold faint Denisovan signatures that once helped lungs draw breath on high plateaus. All of them are working together, without your effort, without your awareness, just as they have since long before anyone spoke the word human. As you drift towards sleep, the boundaries of today, appointments, worries, screens, noise, begin to soften. Underneath them, older rhythms surface, the slow cycling of your body temperature, the ebb and flow of hormones, the nightly choreography of your brain as it prepares to dream. Those rhythms are ancient. They were there when small bands watched auroras over glacial valleys. They were there when Neanderthal children fell asleep to crackling fires and distant animal calls. They carried on through extinctions and migrations, through deserts and ice sheets, through uncounted generations of faces you will never know. Tonight they carry you. So let your thoughts grow quieter. Let your attention loosen its grip. You don't have to hold anything together. Your biology is already doing that for you. The ancient stranger in your DNA, the Neanderthal who never entirely left, can rest now too. Different worlds, same sleep. You and all your forgotten ancestors sharing the same deep, wordless surrender to the dark. Breathe in, breathe out, and let the long tangled history inside you slip gently into dreams.